So
Yes.
thank you. Thanks so much. Thanks everybody for being here in person as well as online. It's a great pleasure. Thanks Jimena and La Universidad de los Andes for hosting us and for solving all our problems. It's a great pleasure and honor to have with us Vernon Smith. Dr. Vernon Smith was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economic Science in 2002 for his groundbreaking work in experimental economics. Dr. Smith has joined appointments with the Argyros School of Business and Economics and the Fuller School of Law at Chapman University. He has authored and co-authored more than 350 articles and books on capital theory, finance, natural resource economics, and experimental economics. Serves or has served on the board of editors of the American Economic Review, the Cato Journal, the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, the Journal of Risk and Uncertainty, Science, Economic Theory, Economic Design, Game and Economics Behavior, the Journal of Economic Methodology. He is the past president of the Public Choice Society, of the Economic Science Association, the Western Economic Association, and the Association of Private Enterprise Education. He has served on the board of many associations and is currently serving in the board of the International Adam Smith Society as well. Vernon Smith was a faculty member at Purdue University, Brown University, University of Massachusetts, University of Arizona, George Mason University, and currently at Chapman University. He has also been affiliated with Stanford University, Caltech, and the University of Alaska, Anchorage. Dr. Smith has been a Ford Foundation Fellow, a Fellow of the Center of Advanced Studies in Behavioral Sciences, and a Sherman Fairchild Distinguished Scholar at the California Institute of Technology. Dr. Smith is also a Distinguished Fellow of the American Economic Association, an Anderson Consulting Professor of the Year, and the 1995 Adam Smith Award recipient conferred by the Association of Private Enterprise Education. He was elected a member of the National Academy of Science in 1995 and received a Caltech Distinguished Alumni Award in 1996. Electrical Engineering at California Institute of Technology, his master's degree in economics at the University of Kansas, and his PhD in economics at Harvard University. He has arrived at Adam Smith a few decades ago, thanks to a Liberty Fund colloquium on Adam Smith, and has been actively involved in Smithian scholarship ever since by combining Adam Smith insights to experimental economics and understanding experimental economics through the idea of Adam Smith. And he also has unveiled the statue of Adam Smith in Edinburgh in 2008. So it's a great honor and privilege to welcome Adam Smith. Sorry, Vernon.
Thank you. I will welcome Adam Smith. Okay, thank you for that very much for that introduction. It's indeed a pleasure. It's my honor to have such a distinguished audience. Now, this is about, I say, propriety, property, and price discovery. Well, propriety and property involves the theory of moral sentiments. Okay, that part of it is Adam Smith's first published book. And then price discovery is the Wealth of Nations, and it's essentially the first 7 chapters, primarily chapter 7, because chapter 7 is where Smith articulates the dynamics of how buyers and sellers find prices in markets. And I consider it to be beautiful. It's very well articulated, and it is not that difficult to convert into a mathematical representation. And that part of it is primarily the work of my co-author, Sabiu Inawa, with my assistance and encouragement. The work on propriety, property comes from largely with my joint work with Bart Wilson in the book Humanomics. All right, so I'm going to begin with, take the next slide. I'm going to introduce the two parts of this talk, each with an experiment. I'm going to use an experiment to motivate bringing in Adam Smith. Okay, now here's what we call in experimental economics kind of a pretty standard trust game experiment. You know, imagine that you have been recruited to the laboratory. You get $7 for showing up on time. You get whatever you earn as a payoff at the end of the experiment. And you're in there, there's an even number of people with you. You are with a group of an even number, say 12, 14, 16, and you are randomly paired. And one of the two is chosen to be player number 1, blue, and the other is player number 2, the orange. Okay, now everybody, my point here is that everybody looks at this game and analyzes it in the same way. Economists, behavioral economists, people off the street, okay? And for example, if 1 passes to 2 and 2 moves down, everybody realizes that 1 is made worse off, because if 1 had played right at the top, 1 would have made 12. If it passed to 2 and 2 plays down, they only get 6. So in analyzing this game, we all assume that people are strictly self-interested. Okay, to benefit is to get more. To be hurt is to get less. Now, so people always assume implicitly that people are self-interested. If people also are assumed to always act in their self-interest, then 1, of course, should never play down. And the reason why I add this second point, whether people always choose in their self-interest or not, they might always do that, they might always not, they might, some may do it sometimes, other times not. That's important because that's the essence of Smith. Smith distinguishes between being self-interested and acting in your self-interest, and that's something we don't do today. See, today we say, well, you choose A over B if and only if the utility of A is greater than the utility of B. So the only if part is Smith would consider wrong, because he has an alternative model, you see, of how people act, and on the assumption that all are self-interested. Okay, next slide. So here's how people actually play the game. And remarkably, over half of the player 1s play down. And 2/3 of the 2s play right. Only 1/3 do what we call defect. This pattern of play was baffling. No, nobody could really see. No one had an explanation. I would claim that nobody had an explanation for this. We were getting this result. We kind of made up some stories about social preferences and about social exchange or reciprocity. We had some stories, but none of them. These are stories that we came up with after we saw these results. Okay. Nobody predicted this before this first experiment was done, the first ones, okay. Okay, next slide. Next slide, okay. Well, Adam Smith did. He did it in 1759. And he did it, and it's because, he has a fair play rule in the theory of moral sentiments that explains why it is that people would do this. We call it Beneficence Proposition 1. It's on page 112 in the Dougal-Stewart edition. So actions of a beneficent tendency which proceed from proper motives, and by Smith, and what Smith means that by that is it's intentional. You intended to benefit this other person. Any onlooker would agree in the circumstances that if you did that, you intended to. Because that's important in Smith, because third parties are involved and approve and would easily approve, you see, of if they're observing two individuals interacting. So there's always in Smith's kind of a social consensus as to what the right thing to do is. And so anyway, which proceed from proper motives, seem alone to require reward, because such alone are the approved objects of gratitude. So this proposition is predicting, you see, the evolution of reciprocity norms in society and of trade and economy. Now, I'm the one that's saying that it predicts trade and economy. It's not clear that Smith does that. And in fact, if you read him, he's not referring back to this proposition. In fact, you don't even know he wrote the theory of moral sentiments if you read The Wealth of Nations. But so this is me. I would say that this beneficence proposition really underpins trade, because each is benefiting the other when we trade, okay, the gains from trade. Okay, oh, and also, it's very clear in that game that one does not have to pass to two. One is completely free, does not have to pass to two. So if one passes to two, it is, I think anyone seeing that would regard that as an intentional action. So it fits this proposition. Or at least I'm hypothesizing that this fits the proposition, and it definitely explains, you see, the results that we didn't have any explanation of. Okay, next slide. Now, sociability is modeled in TMS as a process whereby we learn to go along with our neighbors and following rules that tend to restrain, they modify our self-interest, okay, or the application of it. It's based on Smith's concept of self-command. And as he states it, we're all strictly self-interested, but you can't look your neighbor, the way he puts it is mankind, in the face and avow that your actions are all made in your self-interest. So hence he says we humble the arrogance of our self-love to bring it down to something which others will go along with. He uses the phrase go along with 41 times. He wants you to get it in that book, you see. And it's also connected with fellow feeling, you see, and mutual fellow feeling. This notion of going along with others. And his model offers other fair play prediction rules. So let's go to the next slide. It's not only this one that he offers. He also offers, and we call this Beneficence Proposition 2, he says beneficence is always free. It cannot be extorted by force. The mere want of it, that is, you have a chance, but you pass on it to be beneficial towards someone. And you pass on it. Well, it exposes, he says, to no punishment if you fail to be benefit. That's, in other words, and he says it does no real positive evil. So he's making a prediction here about how people, among the set of beneficent actions I can take, the zero, if it ends up being zero, you don't act, that's not anything that's punishable. So he wants to clearly separate that from his propositions on justice that have to do with punishment. So in a trust game, we should not expect twos to be willing to incur a cost to punish player one for choosing not to be beneficent. So that we're interpreting this proposition to mean that that's your respected right. Okay? Next slide. Well, here's a modification of the game on the left, so we can see if people are willing to punish at a cost to themselves, whether two is willing to punish at a cost to himself, one for not passing to two down. And all that involves is if one decides to go right, play right, and go for the 12-12 outcome, play passes back to two, and now two chooses between 12-12 or at a cost to himself can punish. And we put it's 10-10. So next slide, please. So that was the way we constructed a test. Well, you'll notice that nobody does that. We have 38 pairs here, and 23 of the ones play right, and none of them are punished. It's just twos all pass through and for the 12-12. But notice the addition of that node is changing the way people are analyzing the game, because now you see we only have 39% of the ones playing down rather than 55%. Well, turns out that's a good idea because more twos defect. You see in the right game, we've got 53% of the twos defecting and only 47% playing the cooperative outcome. So people are seeing this game as different. I mean, we haven't explored that, but what I would suggest is that one is seeing it, well, either option, I'm exposed to punishment. That maybe that's what this is all about. Or I'm opposed. I mean, I'm sorry. I'm exposed to defection and ending up with less. Well, if that's true, then the thing to do is to play right at the top rather than down. But anyway, that's the results we're getting, and the important thing is that in terms of the Smith's prediction, he's predicting the non-punishment of this action. Okay, next slide. All right, now here's, instead of the game on the left, suppose we do the one on the right. And this one has the feature that if two decides to defect on one's offer to cooperate, play passes back to one. One now chooses between the defection outcome of 642 or one at a cost to himself, he gets $4 rather than 6, can really punish two for that action. Take $38 away from him. Okay. So we decide to test, take the next slide here. So remember, let's see what Smith says about this. We saw that a fair play rule calls for not punishing one of beneficence. Okay, because Smith says it's not real positive evil. Okay. But his justice proposition does predict punishment in a certain situation. He says actions of a hurtful tendency which proceed from improper motives. I mean, you hurt me and that's what you intended to do, seem alone to deserve punishment, because such alone are the approved objects of resentment. So this game, this new game, you see, has this possibility of a person feeling resentment and willing to incur a cost to punish. So next slide. And here indeed is the play on the right. We now have more people playing down, interestingly, in the right game than in the left game. Apparently, a lot of the ones feel more comfortable passing to 2 if they have this option of coming back to punish one for that action. They feel more comfortable. Well, it turns out that actually the 2s here are defecting even more at a higher frequency. And are they being punished? Well, yes, we've got 24% of the ones are choosing who have an opportunity to punish that, doing so if 2 defects on the original offer to cooperate. Now, you might think, why isn't it even higher? Because one can punish, you see, can severely punish 2 at a pretty small cost to himself. Well, the reason why that is interesting is that Smith, his models speaks of the fair and impartial spectator who's judging, who each person resorts to in making a judgment about how their action is coming off to others and how they're going to choose. And above all, the impartial spectator is a fair play spectator. And an important part of that, as Smith eventually develops, is that the punishment has to fit the crime. Okay? Punishment should be neither too much or too little. So one explanation here as to why, well, why aren't more people doing it, is that people feel that this punishment is too great. So you see, this invites more experiments of this type where we vary the punishment, you see, to see if, to ask how Smith's thinking or reasoning here would apply in this context. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, now, so Smith has these 2 propositions, beneficence and justice. Beneficence is about the neighborly good things we do for each other. Justice is its obverse and is only about achieving security from injury. See, the whole idea in Smith's concept of justice is the punishment, the tendency of people to punishment hurtful acts is our means of trying to deter these hurtful things from happening. Okay. And as Smith argues, this leads to property in the sense of controlling. See, and my most important property is myself. If I'm not protected from murder, I have no property in myself. If I'm protected from murder, but not from theft and robbery, then I have no property in the products of my body and mind. And also violation of contract in commercial affairs. Those are the main acts of hurtful acts that Smith talks about that we can do to each other. Okay. And interestingly, this is a little bit of a side issue, but Smith points out that, of course, in modern societies, these criminal acts are all imposed by government. So that if you commit any of these criminal acts, this is a crime against the public, and the government proceeds to punish you for that. he points out that in societies where government is not very strong, the concern is to simply intervene to prevent the family that is injured by a member of another family, to keep that from becoming a Hatfield versus McCoy's war. In other words, in early societies, the intervention by the authorities are mainly to preserve the peace and not necessarily punish. That's up to, in fact, if you catch the perpetrator of a crime, Smith says, you take it to the head of the family of whoever was injured in that family, and the head of the family decides, or maybe it might the decision might involve the whole family, and the person isn't necessarily, if it's murder, he's not necessarily put down. That's possible, but they may work out a deal. Okay, so where the murder, there's a transfer of property, or there's work done for the injured family. So he talks about, in other words, he's talking about victim compensation as the punishment. Okay, that is the punishment is tied up with victim compensation. Okay, next slide. But, you know, the main point is here that he points out that of the two pillars of society, justice and beneficence, justice is the more important, because no society can even subsist if people are at all time prepared and willing to injure each other. So that really beneficence is less essential to the existence of society than justice. Now, notice that both pillars require common knowledge that all are self-interested. For otherwise, we cannot know what is a benefit or a hurt. Unless we all know and understand and recognize that a certain action produced a benefit or a hurt, unless we are on board with that, then we don't know how to apply these propositions. So implicit. Now Smith never specifically points this out, but it's implicit in all of his examples. He probably thought it was so obvious it didn't need to be stated. But anyway, there is the assumption of everyone here is self-interested, but not everyone acts in their strict self-interest, and the actions are explained, predicted by these propositions. Okay, next slide. Okay, notice that behavioral economists who talk about other regarding action as being due to social preferences, they all analyze this game in the same way. So, and then invoke social preferences. But if you believe people have social preferences, then it's not clear what is a hurt or a benefit. See, I may have played down to you because I want to give you more if there's social preferences. So I find it a little hard to relate to some of that literature. Okay, next slide. All right, now I want to talk about price discovery, markets, and I'm going to begin with an experiment. If you play down here, one more to the next slide. This is my first experiment, January 1956, a really long time ago. And this was a classroom experiment. It was a principal class. I had 22 sophomores in the class, and I had decided I was going to run this experiment. I won't go into all of everything that went on behind that, but anyway, basically, I thought I realized I didn't know anything about the relationship between supply and demand and what people actually do in markets. And so this experiment is to find out what they'll do in this market. Okay, now, so I have 22 sophomores. I make 11 of them buyers. They're here on the left. And I give them each a private secret value. And what I've done here is array those values from highest to lowest. Okay. The sellers, I have all given costs, secret and private. Each person only knows their own value or cost and nothing about what others have. Okay. If you take these costs, array them from lowest to highest, that we would say is a supply curve. So the supply and demand equilibrium here is $2, 6 units trade, and the buyers who have values above the 2 and the sellers that have costs below are the ones that are engaged now in this exchange. That's the prediction. Now notice in the left-hand diagram, what do I have on the vertical axis? I put price there. Well, that's what all the textbooks do. That's what Marshall did. But think about it. There's no price there. There's only values and costs. What should be on the vertical axis is value, comma, cost. Because buyers come to market and they have these values. Sellers come to market and they have costs. There's no prices yet. In fact, there's no prices until people find them. And over here on the right, you see people finding the prices by an oral outcry, two-sided bid-ask auction process. Okay? So, and all of this was understood by Marshall. He understood demand as a distribution function of values and supply as a distribution function of seller willingness to accept values, which we can think of as cost. His error was to put price on the vertical axis because there aren't any prices yet until they're found. And he has a beautiful description, of course, of a country corn market of price discovery. It's right out of chapter 7 of The Wealth of Nations, but it's an elaboration of that. Okay. And notice here on the right, we're having a series of market periods. So there's a flow of goods onto the market. There's, say, from the sellers, and then buyers are buying it from the sellers and taking it away. And then that's repeated. So these supply and demands, we're thinking of those in this experiment, and all of this was described to the subjects. There's a flow across time, you see. So people come to market a second day, and they've now had some experience, and they're trading again, and then period 3, and so on. Okay, next slide. Well, I thought there was something wrong with that experiment, and I figured out that it must be there's too much symmetry. You see, in that previous experiment, the market clearing price is the average value, the average cost, too much symmetry. Because I thought there had to be something wrong with that experiment, because nobody's going to believe this. No one who went to graduate school when I did in those days would believe that 22 sophomores could walk into a room, you give half of them these hidden values, secret values, half of them the cost, and they'd find the equilibrium. That was unthinkable. Because we thought that people had to have complete information. We thought you had to have a really large number of buyers and sellers, otherwise they could manipulate the price. We had all these stories based upon no evidence, so far as I can tell, that we taught, you see. And so here I did this first experiment, and nothing I believed true was being, that I thought was true, was being verified. People were finding these equilibria, and it was very easy. And you could replicate these. Eventually, of course, other people got into the act of replicating these experiments, and indeed, we realized that this is the way this kind of a world that we've created works. Okay. So I right away shot down my idea that it was an artifact of symmetry, not an artifact of symmetry at all. Okay, next slide. Okay, now I want to point out that the classical economists, and I'm thinking primarily of Adam Smith, but his followers they all kind of added to this idea. They modeled agents the way we do in auction theory today. That is, they thought of the commodity space as discrete. Transactions involve single units, okay, of goods. And indeed, think of your own shopping basket in the supermarket. You've got a quart of milk, a pound of bacon, a jar of olives, a small box of Wheaties. Your neighbor has a half gallon of milk, a large box of cornflakes. Notice everybody is buying things in single units. Even bottles of water, you're buying them in 6-packs, 12-packs, 24-packs. The market convenience packages items to solve a consumer inventory problem. So depending upon how often you shop, how big your family is, how big your pantry is at home, you see, you choose which size unit you're going to buy. But what's interesting to me about that is that that's exactly the way Smith is thinking about the world. Those people are buying basically discrete units. Okay. And what that means is in this shopping exercise, the buyers only have to focus on what am I willing to pay? What's the most I'm willing to pay for a quart of milk? You see. And if on some particular day there's a shortage and they're marked up, I may not buy milk, okay? And the presumption is that's because, you see, when we write the demand function there, quantity as a function of price, we have to add in the qualifier that at that price, you are separating the high value buyers from the low values. So, and of course, everyone who's ever been to an auction, and certainly Smith had understood about auctions, realized that as you see the item, buyers bidding on the item and the price goes up, people are dropping out. So it's natural sort of to assume that, well, people are there with the most they're willing to pay, and they're dropping out because the price went above the amount most they're willing to pay. Well, so, and the same thing on the seller's side in a two-sided market. But anyway, Smith, you see, is thinking about markets very much the way we think about auctions today, except he's thinking about both sides, that both the sellers and the buyers have these limit prices, okay? And on the seller's side, sellers are not willing to sell for too low a price because they're not willing to take that hit. Okay, now Smith knew about auctions, and he says, for example, he says that water is very cheap. Water can normally be had just for the lifting. On the other hand, he says there is the story of the Arabian desert where a traveler paid, he says, 10,000 crowns for a single cruse of water. Now, he's illustrating scarcity, is his point. But he then goes on and says it's much the same as in an auction. And then we see this quote from him. He says, it's much the same as in an auction. If two buyers equally desire an item, the one with the larger wealth will carry it. So you see, he understands that the high bid wins. Taste matters, wealth matters. You see, he's got that in his head, and I would argue it guides his thoughts in thinking about supply and demand. So it's a very modern view, although he doesn't have the language, you see, of distribution theory and so on. Okay, next slide. Well, Smith in chapter 7, he says goods have utility, value, and use. That gives rise to their demand and value in exchange, and that's the price. He measures use value by maximum willingness to pay. He talks about effective demand as being this, buyers have this reservation price, similarly for sellers. And he says the price outcome depends very much upon entry competition. Now, of course, it depends upon buyer entry competition as well as seller. But I think you would expect Adam Smith to emphasize the sell side because he's concerned about the mercantilist interferences in the market, which tend to favor the seller side. You see, I think that's why he doesn't. But it is completely symmetric. You have to have competition on both sides. He emphasizes the entry by seller's side of it. And what does he say? What's his kind of model of price dynamics? He says, well, if the quantity brought to market falls short of effectual demand, those willing to pay the price cannot be supplied. In other words, purchases are limited by supply. Some will bid for what they can get and price will increase. So he tells us if there's excess demand, the price will rise. And then in the next statement, he's saying, well, if there's excess supply, the price falls. So he's making really a mathematical statement. He's saying first, the price change has the same sign as excess demand. That's clear. And also at any price, the contracted quantity is limited by the minimum amount demanded or supplied. So in other words, there's short side rationing in the market. So if the price should hang up at a low price, you see buyers can't buy more than sellers are offering. And if somehow price hangs up above that market clearing price, then it's the other way. You see what sellers can't sell more than buyers are willing to buy. Well, that short side rationing idea, I think, is you can make part, you see, of the of the mathematical statement. Okay, next slide. So this is a elementary summation of the mathematics. First, the motivation. Buyers have maximum willingness to pay values, sellers minimum willingness to accept costs. And think of also this being replicated across time with a flow of the Marshallian sort of flow of goods onto and on the market in a series of periods. And then the price adjustment rule is that price change and excess demand have the same sign. So if E of P is excess demand, that times the change in price is never negative. You see, that's always positive. Well, now what Sabiu and I, my co-author, have done, we have added to this the function we call V of P. V of P is the integral of excess supply, the negative of excess demand. And that means that this V, its change with the transaction, can be written as excess supply times dPdt is never never positive. So this is never increasing. Now, if you write that integral for just discrete values and costs, you can see that what the V of P function is doing is simply measuring the distance between the profitable, for any price, the distance between that price and the values that are profitable to the buyers. That's the first part of that term, plus the at any price, those supply costs, those sellers whose costs are not greater than the price. So V is just the overall distance in price space between price and the reservation values costs that are profitable at P. So it's just, this V of P function is just saying, well, if you think of P as variable, okay, what is being varied here is the distance between price and these traders' valuations and costs. Okay, so next slide, please. So we think of the center P star as the center of market value. What does that do? Well, P star minimizes this V of P function. It minimizes the distance between price and the trader's valuations and cost. You see, weighting them only with the profitable values and cost. Okay, it also maximizes the surplus actually achieved or captured by buyers and sellers. It also maximizes trade, which is the minimum between the amount supplied and demanded. So we call that the principle of maximum information. So market price evolves to reflect value better and better. So this change in this V function, V of P function with transactions is never positive. So you see, and there's no parameters in this. This is a parameter-free, very general kind of. And implicitly, I think here is the classical foundations of Hayek on importance of on markets as information systems, and also the mathematical work of Hurwitz, Reidner, Radner on informational efficiency. And I'm going to show you below here using the electrical engineer Claude Shannon in 48 defined a way of measuring the information content of it was in terms of bits, okay, but we can write that in terms of prices. So next slide, please. So here's illustrates these equations and this system. And in panel 1, you see you have here a negative distribution function as an example of demand, and a rising at a diminishing rate inverse distribution function of sellers' costs. And on the left, if the price is below P star, then demand is limited by the amount offered. If the price is above P star, then supply is limited by the demand amount. So we have this short side rationing that we see as implied in the way Smith states price dynamics in a market. And then in panel 2, you have that the U function at the top, that's V of P, and it comes to a minimum. And the function below is the overall surplus actually captured by the buyers and sellers, and that's maximized at P star. And then down below, we have just the steady movement of prices toward a level where they no longer move. Okay, but prices move until they stop moving. And it doesn't necessarily, there's lots of good examples where it isn't necessarily market clearing. You can have excess demand and excess supply, but be in equilibrium. And I don't develop that here, but anyway, the papers following my first paper in 1962 take up those cases. Okay, next slide. So here's the information aspect of it, and bringing in Claude Shannon. If you have a transaction occurring in a market, let's say at some price P, that's revealing information, because what are we doing? It means that a buyer whose price is not higher than that has been matched with a seller whose cost is a price whose value is above that, is matched with a seller whose cost is below that. And so there's an interval there where V is greater than P is greater than C, and this price is revealing. You'll see that there's two people willing to trade, and they've reached a bargain, and information that before was hidden, was not visible to anyone, is now being made visible. Okay, and so think of that as what it means. Information that's probabilistic has now been realized. So Shannon proposed measuring the information in an event as simply the log probability of the event. Well, in a supply and demand market, that would be the log of the ratio of demand to supply, because it's the ratio of demand to supply and in a given P that gives you those values which are higher than P, and those are going to be matched with the costs that are below P. So that ratio seems to us a natural way to implement Shannon's idea of measuring information. Now, that means that the change in information with transaction can be written here as a non-negative number. Okay, that product will be non-negative. So information, just as the V of P function is always going to a minimum as transactions take place, information is moving in the other way. So it's increasing. Next slide, please. Okay, let me give you an example. This is all, the classical model is really parameter free, but suppose we take a particular form of trading institution, and suppose it's a multiple unit English auction, and we have Q units in this example. So next slide. Okay, here the demand function is the array of willingness to pay values of, let's see, I guess we got eight buyers. We got 4 sellers there, and we're assuming they're all willing to sell for at least 10. And the Vic-Read model of a multiple unit English auction, suppose the price starts at 15. Well, in his representation of the multiple unit English auction, if the price starts at 15, you've got someone bids 15, you've got to get 3 matches. So there has to be 4 people agree, well, they're willing to pay 15 before anyone can raise the price. Then, if 4 people agree at 15, then the price can go up. Well, you can see by that representation that price is going to just simply march up until it stops somewhere in this range in here. I'm sorry, up here, that stops out the 5th highest value. So it'll be in here somewhere. So the V of P function, notice that it's piecewise linear because of all of these little flat steps in the demand function. So that's the V of P function. I of P again is piecewise linear, reaches a maximum here. Price marches up here by this point until it stops. And the bid increment, how much it moves up into this depends upon the bid increment. So that'll be part of something that the auctioneer, you see, may be in control of. And here's values moving down to where they become stationary. Okay, next slide. Okay, here's Smith model of social action. We find outperforms the classical model, utilitarian model in the trust games. And we see that by a factor of 2 to 1. We had no other way of predicting this. We had no prediction. We had no explanation of this. Okay, so this was really, I see Smith as providing a really fresh perspective on that. And importantly, Smith distinguishes being self-interested from choosing to act self-interestedly. And that's the thing I think we tend to miss in neoclassical economics and in modern economics. And Smith provides an alternative explanation as to why people may choose A over B, and it's a non-utilitarian. It's everyone is self-interested, but they learn to follow rules to get along with their neighbor. So this is a different way of going after that than we do in neoclassical economics. And then in the Wealth of Nations, Smith modeled price formation from the perspective and experience of the buyers and sellers in the market. And he's thinking about actually modeling those people that are in the market, not our theoretical conception of what people in a market might do. Because automatically in modern literature, we're going to make them maximizers. We're going to do that from the point of view of some sort of optimization model. So these books model the decentralized roots or origins of action in people, then inquires into their consequences. Those are kind of separate and distinct, and I think the way Smith thinks about things. Neoclassical macroeconomics derive optimal quantities demanded given prices before prices have been found in markets. So as we look at this, we see this, the neoclassical thing, formulation of the consumer problem as not really addressing with a thinking process that gears them for modeling for price discovery. Okay. Rather, it's about optimal quantities given prices, but that doesn't solve how prices are discovered. Okay, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. And here you can. These are the Liberty Fund click sites. So the thing that people ought to do is not listen to me, but read these 2 books. Okay. And you can get them free.
Thank you so much, Vernon. It has been a pleasure.
Okay.
I'm going to open up for questions, if you don't mind. and see if there are any questions from the audience, either in person or online. I guess for the people online, if you can raise your hand, then it's going to be easy for me to identify if you have a question or not. Yes, Roger. Hold on a second. Let me take this to you, because otherwise it's difficult to hear.
Thank you. I was just very interested in what you were saying about property as being something that should belong by right in respect of objects which are the product of human mind and body, and whether you would draw Smith's conclusion, which I think is partly related to that, in that the best form of taxation is to not tax people for what they produce, but for their use of land, which has no labor cost of production. It's a free gift of nature, not given in Ricardo's terms. I wonder if you might reflect on that. I'm thinking Henry George, in terms of Henry George, of course, on land value taxation.
Well, I am. Yes, thank you. I hadn't really thought about what the implication is for taxation, but yes, and so well, it's of course the modern stuff in optimal taxation has been involved in taxing consumers. In other words, the final product, because these anywhere other taxes all get in one form or another into the final consumer markets, and that reduces the welfare implications of those markets. Well, I think your question, what it's going to do is motivate me to think a little more about how that fits into this framework, and in particular the implications for property, because I see Smith's concept of property is really coming from the theory of moral sentiments. All he says in The Wealth of Nations is that, well, we have property because obviously the rich they want to be protected from confiscation by the poor. And so naturally, that's the motivation in modern economies for property. But that has implications far greater from that, because that sets the stage for wealth creation, you see, and that's the main message in his book. And of course, that's that wealth creation is no part of people's intention. And one of his examples is that we have property because the wealthy want to keep the poor from taking their stuff, you see. And that's why they do it, but this has unintended consequences and involves the creation of wealth for everyone. But anyway, thanks for the question.
So thank you very much for your talk and this fascinating way to interpret Smith's ideas. I have two questions. The first is related with your final model and the message you provide in the summary. You say agents act choosing to be self-interested, which could be the consequences for the market mechanism if they choose not to be self-interested. Have you reflected on that? And is something in Smith you can talk about it?
Smith says that they're choosing to take actions that are not in their self-interest, but that doesn't mean they're not self-interested. That is Smith's. You see, the way Smith would say it is that we're all self-interested. The question is whether all of our actions are always in our strict self-interest, and he says they're not. And in fact, and our motivation for not making all of our acts in our strict self-interest is we want to get along with our neighbors, okay? And this is the way you do it. So there's all of this, these social exchanges that go on. You know, it's Monday and you're going to work. It's trash day. Before you leave, you put your trash barrel out at the curb for people to pick up. Okay, you come home and you forget to bring in your trash barrel. Your neighbor is out she's bringing in her trash barrel. She notices you didn't bring yours in and brings it in for you. You see, this is the kind of thing that people do in neighborhoods, because notice all the information. For one thing, they know that if you leave your trash barrel out at that night, the street sweeper comes through, and if your trash barrel is out, you get a citation. You see, this is the kind of information that's embedded in local neighborhoods. And then there's a social exchange that goes on. So she brought in my trash barrel. The following Saturday, I'm out picking avocados off my trees, and I pick up half a dozen for her to take over to her, you see. So these exchanges go on all the time, and Smith's propositions really nicely, you see his beneficence proposition nicely fits the trash barrel example as well as the trust game, you see. So yes, people will not take actions that are not in their strict self-interest, and they know what they're doing because they live in an environment where, you see, others approve of that. See, third parties, observers of my neighbor and me, observers of her bringing in my trash barrel and me giving her avocados, they see that, you see, all third party observers see that those are right as kind of right actions. It's the sort of thing that people ought to do. And these are embedded very much in our whole maturation process. Smith says it begins when we first have playfellows around 4.5 or 5. And we find that our playfellows are not as indulgent as our parents were of our expressions of anger. And so we start to come under the influence of people outside the family and immediate home. And he says at that point we are entering the great school of self-command. Okay, we are learning how to manage ourselves, how to command ourselves so that we live comfortably and easily with neighbors.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. My question also addresses of your presentation where you were talking about the theory of moral sentiments. I guess I'm curious as to what exactly you mean by interest when you say that in TMS, Smith assumes that everyone is self-interested. So for example, with the the first line of TMS, if I remember correctly, people do things just for the pleasure of seeing it?
Yes.
Really necessarily implicate the idea of reciprocity there. So when you say that people are self-interested, are you also including that, you know, they're prioritizing their the pleasure that they get from, you know, the joys of sympathy, like the
Well,
definition of interest?
here's the reason why you can't avoid assuming that everyone is self-interested. The reason is we have to all understand what a benefit or a hurt is. Because all of his propositions, you see, have to do with how people react to actions that might be beneficial or they might be hurtful. Okay, so unless we all know what a benefit or a hurt is, we can't even act according to his propositions. These propositions are meaningless unless people are just naturally assume that others are self-interested. But that doesn't mean that we expect everyone to act in their self-interest or that everyone will. That's the important pattern of thinking. The basic logic in Adam Smith, you see, begins with the idea that you make that distinction. And all of his propositions, you have to understand, people, if that proposition is to have any application, then we all have to have a common understanding of what a benefit is or what a hurt is. So, and everyone looks at the trust game, analyzes it in the same way. Okay. And so that is, I think, part of the case that, yes, we assume everyone is self-interested. But his whole model then is based upon actions, you see, that do not have to be in our strict self-interest. And that is his whole theory of society, of neighborliness, you see, as to why we get along or not, because you see, if justice fails, then the whole thing tends to come crashing down. So he's got the central pillars, beneficence and justice. Justice is about preventing, controlling, and limiting the hurtful things we do to each other. Beneficence is about, you see, the good things we do for each other. But everyone is strictly self-interested. Everyone is hurt if they get less. Everyone is benefits if they get more. That's kind of the basic assumptions. So the control of actions, it depends upon people knowing what's hurtful and what's benefit, and it's governed by these rules. And they start to emerge as soon as we have playfellows. Okay, and Smith talks about the pleasure of mutual fellow feeling. You see, in that opening line, later on, you see kind of what he begins, you see what he means by that. He talks about the pleasure of seeing it, because he later talks about mutual fellow feeling. And you look at the words Smith uses a lot. He uses the word harmony. You see, a pitch. There's these musical metaphors which have to do with coordination and being in proper relationship with the elements being in proper relationship with each other. And those metaphors he's applying to people, you see. It's to me, it's just an incredible piece of his two books are just incredible pieces of work, because I think we find in them insights and wisdom that are not plainly evident in modern scholarship and ways of thinking. And for me, I'm able to understand experiments that I wouldn't otherwise be able to explain and understand.
Thank you. This is really interesting. Just a quick follow-up question. I'm probably missing something, but it seems to me that the concept of benefit or hurt requires that we understand that other people have interests, not are self-interested. So, for example, my employee may be a naturally benevolent person who would, be inclined to share everything she has with others, but I still understand that she has an interest in subsistence, for example. So whether or not she is self-interested, she does have that interest, and I can benefit or hurt her according to her interests. No?
Well, remember that how do we know what another person feels? How do we know anything about what another person feels or is experiencing in a particular situation? Smith says it's by in our imagination putting ourselves in that situation. In other words, how do we know what anyone else feels? We do it through this imaginary exercise, which we don't even have to, it may be entirely spontaneous. We may not be thinking about it that way, but we just automatically put ourselves in that other person's situation and ask, well, what would we feel in that situation? So we see ourselves as able to change places with others. We see other people, or we think of others as, in some sense, really just like us. And that may lead to some errors, but it kind of looks like it's good enough in the sense that, you see, that's the way we learn about others, and then we turn that around and ask, well, how do others see our actions? And so now you see we're starting to judge ourselves in terms of how others might see us. So we come to see ourselves as others see us, as Bobby Burns said in his famous. Bobby Burns, of course, was just lived down the street from Adam Smith in Edinburgh. So we come to see ourselves as others see us. So it's all very much based upon that. And if there's a discrepancy between where that model leads us and what we see happening, we need to ask, what are the errors in that model? Where does it go wrong? Does it go wrong in how we see others, or later when in interpreting how they see us? You see, it's a rich and well articulated model of thinking about social exchange. It has moving parts, okay? And I think if we see that there's a problem with it somewhere, we look for which of these moving parts is not working. You see, that's failing. That's the way I think if I was Adam Smith, how I would respond to your question.
I hope this is more of a point of clarification than beating the same dead horse. But it almost sounds as if you are saying Adam Smith uses that kind of Mandevillian enlightened self-interest. And my reading of TMS is that Smith is at great pains to distinguish himself from man-villains. He says, indeed, everyone is self-interested, but everyone also has an inherent other regard. And he's at great pains to say that it's given to us from nature. We're all imbued with this, and that he has two terms that I think are pretty useful. He uses the term our passive feelings. So think about the China earthquake example. He says the man of humanity has these passive feelings where he sleeps fine after hearing about his Chinese brethren having died, but the loss of his little finger vexes him for the night. And he says, well, this is such a sordid kind of thing. Sounds like his man's character is pretty not evil, but sordid, I'll just say. But then he mentions another term. He says, but we've got these active principles. And it's the active principles that the impartial spectator invokes and gets us to think of other regards. So he says, imagine that the man of humanity were actually in control of the situation such that he could sacrifice his own finger to save the Chinese. Would he do that? And he says, of course. We shudder to think of someone who wouldn't do that. Yeah. And the reason he gives in my reading is that the pleasure we derive from our sense of propriety, and if there's actual impartial spectators that see us act this way, they give us praise. If they're not around, then we get a praiseworthiness feeling from our own inner impartial spectator. And that is something that is valued way above the utility we could have gotten saving our finger. So he's got, all these examples, where he talks about the runner, the person who's jogging. And yes, you'd love it if that person fell and you could then win the match, but you would never even think of pushing the person down. Right. And he continues to appeal to it's not like he kind of says that utility is something that we feel, something that's sort of like calculated, but this idea of propriety, it resonates in us, and it's not you. By my hearing, you seem to be saying Smith was smart and he recognized we need to get along with our neighbors and take out our trash due to enlightened self-interest. And I think Smith says we take out our trash because it feels good to share that fellow feeling with the other person. And Smith is, and you said he's not a utilitarian, and that's clear from the reading, but I would say like he's a proprietarian, right? Propriety always comes first, and throughout TMS, he just pushes that idea. It's not utility, it's propriety that is what brings us the greatest satisfaction. And again, it's we never invoke it with our passive feelings, but it's always invoked with what he says active principles. So if you just do a search through TMS for the term active principles, you then see the impartial spectator or some stand-in for them. I don't know if I hope that clarifies, but I'm curious to know if you're actually saying he's following that kind of Mandevillean or Hobbesian enlightened self-interest. What's the answer? Some arguments are so persuasive.
Professor Vernon, can you hear us? Professor? Can everybody hear us? Thanks.
I'm sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah, Professor, we can hear you now.
Okay, I'm sorry. What I was saying was, I think as I read the China narrative that Smith gives us, I think an important part of his point is that nature doesn't preoccupy us with things that we can do nothing about. We can do not. A European can do nothing in the 18th century about these people that are suffering from an earthquake in China. Of course, that's changed. There's now we can do something, but part of his point is that nature concerns us mainly with these situations where we can actually do something, you see. And so the beneficence and justice propositions are applied to situations where actions can make a difference. And people recognize that the actions can make a difference. So that's how, in part, I'm reading the China thing. I must say that's a complex thing, and even there, he's leaving some still. He's still open that people feel some concerns for a fellow human. You see, he's even there leaving something open for that. But I think Smith. Well, I always thought Smith didn't, and Mandeville. I don't know. I think Mandeville is so much fun that you can't help but enjoy it, reading it. But Smith does not like, you see, he doesn't see Mandeville as really properly modeling, you see, the relationships between people. He's still, Smith's model, I would say, is not enlightened self-interest, except that, you see, it's enlightened by these rules that we follow. You see, it becomes kind of an enlightened self-interest, but that's not the. But you don't get it by now putting that in the utility function, because Smith's model involves the relationships between people. And those relationships end up with all kinds of little utilitarian services. But you don't get that kind of an outcome without the general model of modeling relationships. It's not just the sum of those utilitarian services. You see, those are coming from his way of thinking that begins when we first have playfellows, you see, where it's impossible. You're not going to get along with your neighbors if you never think about how your actions affect them. So, but Smith, I think, would not say that oh, well, that's just an enlightened self-interest. All we have to do is put that in the utility function. You see, that's, I think, why he's, throughout the theory of moral sentiments, he's always criticizing utilitarian approaches, including his friend David Hume, because he doesn't see that as a satisfactory way to explain why and how people relate to each other. Okay, so if it's enlightened self-interest, it's enlightened by a really rich kind of way of modeling how people relate to each other. Okay, but saying that can't reduce it to a utilitarian calculus. Okay.
Thanks, Professor Smith, for a brilliant talk. Towards the beginning, I think I heard you say that you don't even know that Smith wrote the theory of moral sentiments. If I'm right, and that is what you said, I wonder if you could unpack or expand on that a little bit.
That Smith didn't write? He doesn't. Well, you read The Wealth of Nations, and you don't realize this guy wrote the theory of moral sentiments.
So you don't feel that the theory of moral sentiments served as a foundation for The Wealth of Nations at all?
Oh, yes, it very much serves as the foundation. In fact, I think without the theory of moral sentiments, The Wealth of Nations has no foundation. But Smith didn't develop it that way. You know, now we know, or at least there's reason to believe, that he thought of the two books that the theory of moral sentiments was the more important. There's the biographies of Smith point out evidence for that Smith had told other people, and they mentioned it in their autobiographies, that Smith thought. Well, I think yes, it is. And in fact, one of the things that it's almost as though Adam Smith has a Das Adam Smith problem, because why doesn't he use the beneficence proposition from the theory of moral sentiments to explain why people trade? You see, if you trade, then I'm benefiting you, you're benefiting me. It's a natural sort of application. In social exchange, there is commonly a time lag between me doing something for you and you doing something to me. Well, in economic exchange, that time lag shrinks to zero, and we are simultaneously doing something each for the other. And to me, it's just a very natural application of Beneficence Proposition 1. But Smith makes, it's almost as though he's now, if he had written a great work on jurisprudence, which he had planned, maybe he would have got this all brought together. We don't know. And of course, his papers were all burned, so we don't even know to what extent he had already kind of developed a lot of that. We're just left, and so there's this huge deficit. But no, I can't. To me, The Wealth of Nations very much, there has to have. He first wrote a book having to do with society, and where society comes from, and what its characteristics are, and how it depends upon these rules and order in order to have a society. With a society, then you can also have an economy. In fact, it's a very straightforward extension of that. Probably began almost as early. Economics surely began almost as early as society did. But it's the thing I like about his propositions and that work is it's very testable. I mean, this is about real stuff that can happen, and I think they have natural applications.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Vernon. Thank you for your time. Thank you for all the toil and trouble that you had to go through to log in with us. It's been a great pleasure. Are there questions online? Okay, perfect. We hope to see you soon, maybe in person sometime in the near future. And I guess all the people in front of me are thanking you as well.
Okay. Well, thank you, Maria. It's been a great pleasure. I just love this audience, okay, and the good questions.
Great. Thanks again. See you soon.
Okay.